takes an expert.
Just take someone wandering over here.
Oh, all right. Good evening. Welcome, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tom. I am the current chair of the Canterbury Socialist Society, and I just want to welcome you all to this this lecture this evening, the Fred Evans Memorial Lecture. So this is the first annual. Our plan is to do an annual Fred Evans Memorial Lecture. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce our speaker at the end, but first I'm just going to go into a little bit of our thinking around this lecture and who it's named for. And there's some interesting serendipity actually around the timing of this event, which was not intentional, but it's quite an interesting piece of our New Zealand working class history. So last year for at our AGM, we sort of decided that we'd have one lecture a year where we would invite an academic from either locally or around New Zealand, or hypothetically internationally when we have the sort of funding to do that, to speak about something to do with socialist history, New Zealand labour history, international labour history, something of interest to what our society usually talks about, and have that as sort of a high point event for the year. The reason we've named it for Fred Evans, so for those of you who don't know, Fred Evans was an Australian-born mine worker. He was born in, he lived in Ballarat in Australia and moved to New Zealand in 1909 to work in Waihi, where the gold miners in the North Island. And he was a member of the Trade Workers Union, Mine Trade Workers Union up there. In 1912, there was the Waihi miners' strike. It was a very significant labour dispute in New Zealand labour history. It went on for 6 months, so it started in May of 1912, and on the basis that the union was protesting the formation of what they considered a scab union, a breakaway union, which had been set up, in their opinion, by the employer. They were probably correct on that. So they went on strike. At that period, the Mine Workers Union, the legitimate one, of which Fred Evans was a member, they were also affiliated to the Federation of Labour, which at that time had the nickname the Red Feds. So they were quite a radical militant sort of Federation of Labour, organising multiple unions around the country. Their leadership was made up of people including like Bob Semple, a lot of people who went on to become leading members of the Labour Party, which actually ties in quite well with what I think Quentin's going to be speaking about later. So during this dispute, for a while, the local authorities sort of took a soft-handed approach with the dispute. They just let it play out. You know, the miners were on strike. Eventually they started bringing in a bit of scab labour to reopen the mine in October, and at that point a considerable amount more violence started going on. So scab workers were escorted by police to be able to get to the mine, and often pelted with insults, but also rocks and so on. And this came after the police commissioner at the time sort of overruled the local authorities, and they actually sent in about 80 police from around New Zealand into Waihi. Now Waihi isn't a very big town, and we're talking about 1912 in New Zealand. That represented about 10% of the entire New Zealand police force, descending on Waihi to try and help break the strike and get scab labour through the doors of the mine. So November the 12th, which was yesterday, so we're very good timing actually with this event. November the 12th, and it was a Tuesday in 1912 as well, which came to be known as Black Tuesday. A group of police and strike-breaking workers sort of looked to break into and take over the miners' hall, which was being sort of used as a base for the striking workers, and at that point was being defended by Evans and 3 other striking workers. There was some sort of struggle in the doorway. One of the strike breakers was shot in the knee, and a police constable was shot in the stomach. Fred Evans himself was hit by a baton and went down unconscious and was taken to jail. He was left there for an hour and then eventually taken to hospital, but he never regained consciousness and died on the 13th of November, so exactly 107 years ago today. So Fred Evans is one of the few martyrs in New Zealand labour history. He was a relatively unknown unionist, like by all means a committed unionist, but after this happened, you know, it was one of the few examples of a death during an industrial dispute. He became a bit of a martyr for the labour movement. The Red Feds did organise an enormous, very politicised funeral for him, and I believe about £1,100 was raised in support for his family. And in today's money, from what I did a little bit of research, it seems like that's somewhere around $180,000. So a considerable amount of money. Bob Semple, I mentioned before, who is perhaps more well known for an extremely eccentric design of tank during World War II. At the time he said, I don't know if Fred Evans shot that police officer, but if he did, he was only doing his duty and he should have shot more of them. So an interesting take from who would later become a Labour Party MP and Minister. So part of the thinking with wanting to draw attention to Fred, and I will actually mention another martyr of the Labour movement, one of the only other people to be killed during an industrial dispute, Christine Clark, who was killed in 1999 just over the hills in the port of Littleton on a picket line when she was run down by a motorist. So part of honouring Fred is not to be part of, sometimes the Labour movement, our martyrs can become these really big figures, and it can seem almost like a death cult or something like that, and it's not really that. What I like to say and what I try to impart here is that the workers' movement, the Labour movement, the socialist movement, whatever you want to call it, it's had quite enough martyrs, actually. There are plenty of graves that have been filled, and here's to hoping that there aren't going to be very many more, preferably none, because there's been quite enough fucking workers being put in the ground, just trying to get what's right for them. So we do honour Fred though, and yeah, so thank you for coming along to this first one. Just a little bit of admin before I introduce our speaker. So we'll probably just run through to the discussion period, like Quentin's going to speak, and then we'll run through to questions, unless people are really dying for a break, in which case we will take a quick break and then come back for questions. If you haven't been to our events before and you aren't on our emailing list, we do have a mailing list over on the table there. There are also some stickers and badges which you're very much welcome to just take. Those are free for anyone to take. If you want to give us a little coin donation, you're welcome to. We also have copies of just recently arrived Wage, Labour and Capital, a bit of a classic by Marx, which the Socialist Society executive have sort of re-edited into, for one thing, New Zealand English, but also just corrected some errors and stuff from the online free translation and printed them as books. And those are available to purchase for $10, unless you would like to join the Socialist Society, in which case you get a free one, but the membership fee is $30 for the year. At any rate, I want to move on to just welcoming Quentin and thanking him so much for coming to speak to us about this topic. So I believe the topic is the early New Zealand Labour Party and the influence of socialism as an ideology on sort of the Labour Party's policies and politics at that time. How much of a force was it on the Labour Party? Quentin is a local unionist based in Canterbury and recently earned a PhD on this topic. So we're really, really lucky to have him come and speak with us, and I'm looking forward to a really interesting talk. I think that's it from me. Otherwise, I'll hand it over to Quentin. Thank you.
I can hear the giggling already. Oh, they might be probably streaming it. Thank you, Tom, and again, thanks for actually having me here. I don't know about expert. This takes me back, and so I'm holding this microphone, of course, to the 1990s and student protests, and of course, and then of course the alliance and the new Labour Party, of course, back then. So you know, it seems kind of familiar and so on with that. Usually I wander around a lot. It's been a long time since I've actually given a lecture of any size and so on to people, and so you know, if I break down or something like that, you know, you'll have to forgive me for actually doing that. Now, my topic was socialism and the early Labour Party. Now, some people could ask, well, you know, essentially, is there anyone here who believes the Labour Party was actually formed from the West Coast? Anyone here? Excellent. That's because, you know, that's one of the most common misconceptions. And when I actually pointed out to a colleague of mine that the Labour Party wasn't formed on the West Coast, he got actually very, very upset by it. But in fact, no, it wasn't. And so we're talking a bit about that and so on as well. But the first thing I actually do want to talk about, and I do want to actually acknowledge what Tom said about Frederick Evans, was that the early Labour movement, particularly the early Labour cabinet ministers, and I'm thinking, and also the early Labour leaders, and I'm thinking of course of Harry Holland, Michael Joseph Savage, Peter Fraser, Bob Semple, Paddy Webb, were all actually leaders in the Red Feds and so on throughout the time that they were actually there. And what happened in Waihai, of course, spread across the 1913 general strike, where in fact the state, or the government and so on at the time under William Massey, who was the Prime Minister, there was a huge strike, a huge lockout, and they actually conscripted, or rather they got volunteers from farmers' bodies. They called them Massey's Cossacks, and they're in fact one of the largest contingents of them came from out here at Lincoln, where I used to work and so on for a long time, to actually come, man the ports, and essentially club workers and so on in their spare time while they were actually doing it. And there was a very famous trial where Harry Holland, of course, was the first leader of the Labour Party, was actually arrested for sedition as a result and so on this. And Holland actually made a speech to the dock where he said that the police and the army, who were actually, because they had machine guns on Wellington Wharf to actually protest against the strikers, they should know where their class loyalties lay and point their guns accordingly. Not surprisingly, that did not go down very well with Robert Stout, who promptly arrested Holland and jailed him for a period of time. So that was actually the makeup and so on of the early Labour Party. And as I said, when you think of the Labour Party now, you don't really associate it with that sort of vigour. And I'm also reminded and so on too, actually, when I was a member of the NLP, and I'm sure that Paul Pierce will, we used to have basically Phil Amos, who used to be the president. Yep. Phil was the president and so on for a considerable period of time in our NLP meetings, essentially when I used to annoy Jim, which used to be a lot. Phil would take me across the road to the Thorndon pub, and he said to me that when he came back from World War II, he basically was filled with piss and vigour, and basically he used to track down Peter Fraser. It would have been about 1947, and said to Fraser that what they needed was a socialist Labour Party, whereupon Fraser looked at him with a stony glare and said, "Over my dead body." And Phil said you were left in no doubt whose body was going to be dead and so on at the end of it. So that was it. So in terms of the Labour Party and socialism in 5 minutes, which is actually not going to take 5 minutes, but it's actually a name that was given to by John A. Lee. Do people know who John A. Lee was? Yeah. Well, this is actually part of a reply that Lee had to Harry Holland, where he accused Holland of wanting socialism in 5 minutes. So I just sort of adopted it. Now, the Labour Party in the 1920s was a dangerous organisation. And this is just one of the posters and so on that you can actually see. It demonstrates how dangerous it was. You can see there's a vaguely Russian person up here. He's got little strings attached to all the ports. And he's basically saying, that essentially the ad says, well, basically, if you support Labour, you're supporting the communist takeover of New Zealand. The only way to do it, as Conservatives actually said, the Reform Party at the time, is do not underestimate the gravity of the present political situation. The Labour Socialist Party is powerfully organised. It aims at securing control of the country's affairs. Votes Coates for Coates and safety. And this went on for a long period of time, all the way from 1919, all the way actually up until 1935. And one could argue actually even beyond 1935, that it becomes, I seem to remember in 1984, someone accused the Labour Party then of being socialist, and you all had a big giggle of something about it, But basically, it was certainly seen as such. So the purpose of my talk and of my thesis was to actually look at the history of Labour socialist parties until the formation of the New Zealand Labour Party in 1916. Socialism, what it was and what it meant to the New Zealand Labour Party, because those of you who believe that socialism is just one thing are very sadly mistaken. The discussion of New Zealand Labour Party's socialisation objective and what that actually meant, and really examining Labour's policy platform, primarily its economic and social policy, as a means of achieving socialism. And to that I'd also add too that basically Labour was quite keen on constitutional reform. So what I've got here is essentially a bit of a map, one could actually say, of the various parties, because the lead up to the New Zealand Labour Party was not basically straightforward. As you can see here, you have one party, the Socialist Party, which can probably be the only party that can be described as a truly socialist party. And then, of course, you have the Independent Political Labour League, which was a combination of trade unionists and essentially Lib Labs or Labour Liberals, and basically people who were pissed off and so on really about the present political league. They formed a Labour Party. They went on to form a Labour Party, the original Labour Party. You had independents. They went on and formed the United Labour Party. Then basically after that fell apart after the result of the 1913 general strike I was talking about. They all went and formed the Social Democratic Party, but a number of people for the United Labour Party didn't want to join with them, so they remained as basically independents in Parliament. And then in 1915, actually, or in 1916, they actually went and formed the New Zealand Labour Party. Now I say 1915 because in fact the Labour caucus was actually formed before the New Zealand Labour Party. And that is, the caucus came together in 1915. Again, the caucus came together because of the fact, not because of the fact it was opposed to the war. In fact, the only person who was actually opposed to the war was actually Paddy Webb, who spent several times in jail for sedition. But in fact, because the Labour Party at that time, or the Labour caucus at that time, constituted 5 people who constituted the official opposition and so on in Parliament, they were more interested in actually ensuring that there was a parliamentary opposition to the United and the Liberal Party, the Reforming Liberal Party, than they were actually about, essentially achieving socialism. So most of the early Labour parties simply wanted more progressive versions of the Liberals. They wanted to recapture radical liberal ethos. There was a feeling that essentially the Liberals had run out of puff after the death of Seddon, who was seen as a fantastic Liberal premier. And so essentially they wanted to recapture that, those early parts and so on of the Liberal Party agenda from 1890 through to about 1896. The early Labour parties mainly concerned with securing Labour representation, and that is all they really wanted was actually boots in the house. They essentially just wanted people in Parliament who would promote Labour values and Labour points of view. And in fact, the first New Zealand Labour Party, the first one in 1902, actually apologised for the use of the term Labour in its name. And as said down here, our party takes the name of Labour for its distinctive title, not as seeking to represent and uphold a section of people alone. And they actually then said, we want to represent everyone, not just one single group of people, but everyone. So there you have a McClayton's Labour Party. And that was what actually basically symbolised a lot of the early Labour parties and so on here. Now, there was quite bitter conflict within the Labour movement. Basically, as you can see there in some of that picture, the one with the 2 feuding cats, essentially the ULP and the SDP. The right of the Labour movement, which was bound up in the United Labour Party and the Labour Party, wanted a solely Labour agenda, Labourism. And the left, which at this point had become more associated around the Red Feds and of course the Socialist Party, wanted a socialist program and objective. They did not get on, and there was no room and so on for them in each other's party. And they spent a lot of time actually arguing with each other. In fact, a lot more time and so on was spent doing that than actually combating the Tories. Now, after 1913, basically, and the crushing, and that's the only way it can actually be described and so on, of the Red Feds, and of course, basically there was a move to actually bring all the Labour parties and all the left groups and so on together. So they had the creation of the Social Democratic Party, which I actually have a copy. I actually rescued this from the Labour Party, and it's actually part of their Unity Conference from 1913, and they all came together to actually form a united federation of Labour and a political arm, which was the Social Democratic Party. And the Social Democratic Party, of course, was committed to the socialisation of means production, distribution and exchange. And it was one of the few reasons, because of the fact that the 1913 strike had been such a disaster for Labour, it actually caused them actually to think and come back. So it was quite a big conference, but even then, after forming the SDP, there was still a large amount of unrest with a number of people, including George Ford, who was a Liberal MP, a former Liberal MP, refusing to sit down with the so-called evil socialists, as he put them, who were basically undermining New Zealand society, or as he called it, British culture and civilization. And basically they went off and continued to sign with the ULP. The SDP nonetheless basically developed a range of policies, including wholesale nationalisation, land policy, healthcare, education, and of course the creation of citizens' militias and so on like that, the abolition of the army, most of which, apart from the citizens' militias, later found themselves in the Labour Party. And so that's something to actually be aware of. Now, Labour is a socialist party, and I reminded that basically, I think it was Dave Collier the other day talked about on Facebook, he sent a post about the British Labour Party, one of the candidates and so on there, talking about essentially the working class ethos and so on of the British Labour Party and what she stood for. And if you actually read this, whilst policies may change and methods may differ, our goal, socialism, is always the start which we hitch our wagon, Bob Simple. Consciously or unconsciously, Marxist dogma was a domineering influence underlying Labour's policy in the 30s. While we saw the pump priming function of injecting money into the economy by way of higher wages and guaranteed prices as the immediate priority, we shared a gut feeling that the basic task of the Labour government was to defend the workers against their exploiters. And that was actually said by Owen Wilson, who was a backbench MP in 1935 to 38 and had been a member of the Labour Party. So if you read that, basically you come to the conclusion that Labour was actually a radically socialist party that with Marxian underpinnings. I can see Paul Pierce grinning already. So I'm here to say that's complete crap. So basically, and the best way to actually talk about it is to actually have this wonderful quote, of course, by Harry Holland. Labour parliamentarians, that is that Labour MPs were actually very diverse. Alfred Hindmarsh, who was the first chairman of the Labour Party and basically the first leader of the Labour Party, was a moderate from a liberal background. And Hindmarsh was a person who essentially said that he wanted the Labour Party to represent all classes in Parliament, not just one class. Now, in 1918, after the Grey election and after he'd been released from prison, Harry Holland, of course, stood in Buller. The background to that was that Paddy Webb, who was then essentially the MP for, I think it was Grey, had been arrested for sedition and being extorted to Parliament. And because of the fact, extorted to jail, and because he was in jail, he couldn't actually attend Parliament. So basically, as a result of not attending Parliament, they essentially said that he could no longer be an MP. And the Liberals thought it was going to be an easy walkover and so on for them. but it turned out to be wrong. Harry Holland won the seat. He essentially turned up in Parliament and made his dramatic speech about, the objective of the Labour movement being socialism. It did not endear him to Hindmarsh at all, and he frequently clashed with Holland all the way through this, to the extent that by the end, I think, of 1918, that was seen the Labour Party at that point was actually going to fall apart, that there was no coherence whatsoever. But basically what happened was that Hindmarsh died as a result of the flu epidemic. By this time, Peter Fraser and Bob Semple had been elected. They block voted and appointed Harry Holland as the first leader of the Labour Party. Hence, the Labour Party continued. But throughout all that, Labour tried to distance itself from the militants and so on. So that was sort of the short history and so on of the Labour Party all the way up to basically 1918. Now, as I said, there are many, basically, my thesis was about the relationship between socialism and the New Zealand Labour Party. And while it might appear that the relationship between both Labour and socialism acknowledges, the point of view rests on misconceptions about the nature of socialism and its relationship with the party. The history of the British Labour Party is replete with books and articles examining that party's philosophical and problematic development from 1900 until the present. There are a number of books which deal with the British Labour Party's relationship with socialism, but in contrast, the literature and the development of the New Zealand Labour Party is actually pretty sparse. In fact, it could be put across really one, well, not even one bench and so on in the library. It's really quite unscarce. And most of the popular books dealing with the subject were actually written in the 1960s and 70s. And the last book, which was actually written by my former supervisor, Jim McAloon, and Peter France, this one here, was released a couple of years ago. And that was the most recent book, probably in about 40 years, on the history and so on of the Labour Party. There hasn't been anything really written and so on about the Labour Party and so on, in 40 years. Snippets of information during the party's development are also contained within the various bibliographies. So essentially, if you own a bibliography and so on of John A. Lee, Michael Joseph Savage, Walter Nash, there are also snippets and so on in there about what they were doing. And those details, but they tend to be narratives. And in fact, they're not really dealing with the Labour Party as such until 1935. So it's sort of all sort of snowed over until it basically come to 1935, and then everything sort of snaps to attention, and this is what Labour was doing. And as a result, discussions about the Labour Party and its relationship to and with socialism are really largely generalised. Is simply taking at face value what is meant by socialism, when Gustafsson, for example, declares in his book, Labour's Path to Political Independence, that the Labour Party was committed to an objective of socialisation. When Peter Fraser announced to an audience in 1920 that the New Zealand Labour Party was as socialist as any other party, or when Bob Semple, who was the NZLP president at the time in 1927, said, like I said, that our goal of socialism is always the far to which we hitch our wagon. So, Labour basically did not really adhere to one solid view of socialism. And that in fact Harry Holland, again in 1924, speaking about it in Parliament, in a rebuttal really to the Tories, would always throw across the fact that, well, Labour's full of Marxists, it's a Marxist party, look at what's happening and so on in Russia, essentially, this is what you want to do here, made this quote. Of course, many members of the Labour Party, I am not now referring to the members in Parliament, but to the general membership of the party, accept the Marxist philosophy, and many of them do not. There are different schools of thought in the Labour Party. So essentially, there was not really a consensus and so on there about what Labour actually meant. And as I said, basically the NZLP attracted different socialist and progressive proponents. These range from those who subscribe to Marx to others who are motivated to socialism because of their Christian upbringing. And of course, the Christians saw the socialist state as an extension of the teaching of Christ. And then, of course, you had others, of course, utopian socialists, guild socialism, which was very strong, I understand, in the railway workshops and so on here. Fabian socialism, and the Fabians, of course, the victory and so on of gradualism, were actually very strong up and down the country in the early part and so on of the century as well. Marxism, scientific socialism, which wasn't actually that well known in New Zealand, and of course the majority one, which was labourism and trade unionism, the idea that in reality what you just wanted was things fairer for workers. And so basically that was really what the Labour Party actually was doing in terms of its philosophies and so on at that point in time. So other Labour supporters, of course, were merely looking for more radical and progressive versions of the programs put in place by the balance of several Liberal administrations, as I said before, from 1891 to 1906. And we can't actually underestimate the impact of what I term as new liberalism on the Labour Party. And it dominated as an economic and philosophical thought, though there wasn't much philosophy behind the Liberals at all, between the late 19th and early 20th century. So basically it actually spearheaded a lot of the reform. The Liberals, of course, used the state as a redistributive tool, economically and socially, although it was very limited. And they practiced what could be termed as sort of a limited social liberalism. So basically that was, basically they increased, they imposed old age pensions, they put in the first wage tax and so on like that. They established some sort of basic welfare system. And this found a resonance, as I said, within the Labour movement, who thought, well, gee, if the Liberals can do it on this scale, why can't we do it on a much grander scale? So it essentially appealed to a number of unions and to a number of socialists. And New Zealand was not unique, because the same thing, of course, was happening in the United Kingdom and so on as well, with Lloyd George and Asquith and so on over there. And the Labour Party became, again, very enamoured of social liberalism and so on over there. Now, because of the fact that really you're sort of a disparate party, danger of being at war with each other, constant fights, you need something to actually unite you all together. And so what they did was essentially they all put it together in what we could say is ethical socialism. And so ethical socialism was essentially not a scientific philosophy. It was basically an assurance that the party would right the various wrongs of existing capitalist society. And while it's, so basically it's an ethical crusade that's offered up there to transform society and make it fairer and more inclusive for workers. And basically again, essentially Labour representatives of the vast bulk represented the vast bulk of people, not just workers. And even though there are a number of Labour MPs that say we represent workers, we're about the working class, there are also a vast number of Labour MPs and Labour Party members who say, well, look, we also represent farmers, shopkeepers, anyone else and so on who feels that essentially they're being exploited. It was an ethically based philosophy designed to pacify really both the left and the right of a party, and that was evidenced in the socialisation clause. Now, Paul Foote, who's actually a British-based political philosopher, said that it's very easy to actually knock the naivety of ethical socialism. It nonetheless provided Labour politicians with a rallying vision both in New Zealand and in the United Kingdom. And their naivety was important because it was to reverberate in the hopes and aspirations of the Labour movement. This concept of a society of healthy and happy families living in a new Jerusalem. its moralistic critique of the corruption and degradation of a competitive society was to be at the heart of British socialism, and going to say New Zealand socialism and so on as well throughout this time. It was very easy. I mean, essentially you looked at the morass, you looked at sweating in Dunedin, you looked at what was happening and so on in the wharves and in the streets. It was very easy to say socialism will stop this. All you had to do is vote for us, and we can promise you, in the words of Barbara Betts, of course, who later became an MP and so on, the British Labour Party, Jan today or Jan tomorrow. Now, it didn't offer, as I said, a definitive program. As footnotes, it provided it was incapable of providing an answer to, for example, unemployment, poverty, budget deficits, or any other practical program. And as such, it proved incapable of delivering the type of world that Labour's representatives promised. But this failing, even though it became apparent in the 1920s, essentially was important, or rather the idea was important in Labour's formative years because it bound the party together. And nowhere was it more important than actually the socialisation clause and so on of the New Zealand Labour Party. Now, the ambiguity over the definition of socialism particularly evident in the adoption of the socialisation objective in 1916. People see this as basically like clause 4 of the British Labour Party, as sort of like the commitment to socialism, but it wasn't actually there at all. The objective of the socialisation of the means production, distribution and exchange should be seen less as a militant call to arms and more as a means of placating the various factions within the Labour Party. The various issues between the militants and moderates, or rather as it should be called the left and the right of the Labour Party, had caused considerable dissent in the past. They were determined that it wasn't going to do again. And so what socialism meant to the party basically still caused considerable debate amongst Labour's representatives, its members and even its opponents. The first chairman of the Labour Party, Alfred Unmarsh, as I said, declared himself a socialist, but for him, Marsh, socialism was an inclusive ideology which sought the cooperation of all classes. Economic and social justice will be eliminated, and basically through widespread public ownership. And this socialist vision was at somewhat variance with that of Harry Holland. For Holland, of course, socialism would be achieved only when the workers had complete control of the means of production, distribution and exchange. Now, the argument about what constituted socialism was not limited to New Zealand. As I said, it was actually far and wide across the UK, Canada and so on like that as well. And the early American socialist Jesse Wallace recommended, basically remarked that the divergence within socialism given rise to saying that socialists are of 57 variants. And in fact, there was I was reading a point in one of her books where someone transferred, I think, from the Manitoba Socialist Party to the Szechuan Socialist Party, and there was a huge debate as to what they actually meant by socialism that nearly broke out in a huge fight. So, that essentially was, sort of the conception at the time. And so, consequently, the inclusion by the New Zealand Labour Party of the socialisation objective should be seen less as a political victory for the left and more like the party's unofficial adoption of ethical socialism as a means by which various and opposing socialist philosophies could be reconciled. And the British Labour Party, as I said, adopted the Common Ownership Clause for in 1918 for much the same reason. And again, that clause was a means of placating both the left and the right of the party. And essentially it was done because of the fact that the vagueness clause allowed it to act as a unifying force within the Labour Party. The various Labour and socialist organisations credited to the UK Labour Party exhibited widely different views about socialism and war. Some organisations favoured a type of workers' control, while others wished to be an extensive version of nationalisation. And a similar situation existed here. And basically an objective, i.e. the socialisation of the means of production, distribution and exchange, which defined as, could basically be used as a means of essentially sort of really papering over the cracks. For basically those on the left of the Labour Party, it meant workers' control. For those on the right of the Labour Party, it meant essentially public ownership and nationalisation. And in the 1920s, public ownership and nationalisation, if you believed in that, you were actually on the right of the Labour Party. So I just wanted to say that. So essentially it was quite useful to actually basically bringing the party and so on together. Now, while seemingly united, as I've said, it was a party of really practical contradictions. For some, the New Zealand Labour Party was a party of unionism and practical reform, and those people and so on who came across from the United Labour Party and the original Labour Party. Yet it was also a political organisation promoting a radical socialist ideology which sought to fundamentally change the structure and nature of society. And as Harry Holland again informed the House of Representatives, the party was seeking a society in which a man's worth would be provided by his work rather than by his wealth. A very famous speech and so on from him. And this contradiction is most evident when one examines what party members thought it should do to really realise a socialist society once it had achieved government. Now, amongst some people and so on in the Labour Party, it was very simple. Once you formed a Labour government, once you controlled the levers of power, you just pass a law and abolish capitalism. Voila, capitalism will be finished and you'll be able to achieve a socialist state. To others, socialism, that's right, exactly. To others, socialism would be achieved as a result of a systematic and gradual program of policy changes which would take place over a number of years. The result of those changes would be the gradual subversion of capitalism and the establishment of a socialist society. And some people didn't actually even want that at all. They just wanted things just be nicer and a bit fairer and so on to the workers. So that was the sort of the situation that the Labour Party found itself in 1919 when it was actually formed. And one of the ways in which they said they'll do it is essentially by economic control and public ownership. All the Labour parties, including the socialist parties, believed and so on in public ownership and nationalisation. And in fact, in 1923, 1924, as talking today about the sugar crisis. New Zealand faced a sugar crisis in 1923. Essentially, Chelsea's sugar, which had actually been given a which was actually had subsidies and protection by the Conservative government during the war, was going to remove it, basically, and there was a huge crisis. If they removed the subsidies, what would happen to sugar? New Zealanders loved sugar. Even 100 years ago, we loved sugar. And it sparked a huge public debate. And it basically went on for months and months and months and months and months. And essentially the Conservatives actually argued that in fact the sugar should be basically controlled and subsidised by the government. The Labour Party argued that in fact that the sugar works should actually be nationalised by the government. And the Liberals basically argued both things at the same time. So essentially they argued that in fact maybe that they could nationalise it. And maybe if that didn't actually work, maybe they should look at going for some subsidy, and maybe it wasn't that bad and so on, if the market actually determined what happened. In the end, it was quite a key argument, and essentially it demonstrated Labour's resolve and so on at the time to actually use nationalisation, so much so that the Conservative Minister of Finance, Downey Stewart, was basically their version of, Bill English, essentially said to the Labour Party at the time, nationalisation, nationalisation, that's all you guys actually talk about. And in fact, Holland remarked and said, well, you know, essentially nationalisation is great. Look in Australia, where things are completely nationalised, look at how successful and so on they are actually there. So it formed a key part of Labour's philosophy and essentially and its program. So everything could be achieved by nationalisation and public ownership. And once it was actually achieved in public ownership, the logic was is that once you actually had in public ownership, well, Parliament was elected by the public. Basically, MPs were responsible to the public. So therefore, if Parliament owned it and the state owned it, therefore it was publicly owned and therefore democratic. So that's what I say. Socialism equals collective good equals public ownership. And they believe this. Okay, there's no debate, there's no discussion. This was basically at the root and so on of Labour's philosophy. The other one, of course, was essentially the New Zealand Labour Party was convinced it was to achieve its crusading aims. It also had to be done through the parliamentary process. So basically it was completely committed to parliamentarianism. And it could be done also via education and just simple persuasion. So the defeats of industrial labour in 1890 with the maritime strike, and then again in 1913, demonstrated to Labour's socialists that the changes they sought would only be achieved through the use of the parliamentary process and the democratic procedure rather than revolutionary action. Because as far as they were concerned, the lessons out of that was essentially you either became involved or you lost. And what they picked up from 1913 was that they had been completely, absolutely outmaneuvered by Maxis and by the state and by the use of state forces. So what was better than to actually control the state? Hence, So the electoral success of international Labour and social democratic parties further accentuated this perspective, because throughout the 1920s, 1930s, Labour parties, and in the early part of the 20th century, Labour and social democratic parties grew at quite a phenomenal rate. In Europe, essentially Labour parties in Germany, of course, they were the major opposition by 1914. They voted for war credits and for World War I. They were the major substantial party throughout Europe. In the UK, of course, Labour had become a force after World War I. Essentially Ramsay MacDonald essentially had formed the first Labour government in Britain in 1923, and of course in Australia, 24, wasn't it? Yeah. And in Australia, of course, essentially the first Labour administration, I think, was formed in 1906 by Fisher, but there have been state Labour governments and so on before that. So Labour felt that essentially it was onto a good deal, that it was actually on a real roll, and it was actually growing. And of course, what also committed Labour to parliamentarianism was, of course, the Bolshevik Revolution after 1917. And essentially, they needed something inside to distinguish themselves from the Bolsheviks, and essentially parliamentarianism was that they could actually emphasise the socialist route to, the parliamentary route to socialism. And Harry Holland actually said that essentially that the fact remains that here in New Zealand, as in most other British-speaking countries, we have agreed to use we have learned to use the political machine. We have learned to look upon the political method as a method of liberty, as a constitutional right fought for through long centuries, and at last won by the people. Completely and absolutely committed for it. So, what they actually had here was basically, just returning to that one, just what did it mean? Well, basically they sought an increased role for workers in the economic and social spheres through radical electoral participation through the combination of direct and indirect democratic frameworks. And so essentially Labour was committed to proportional representation, recall, which essentially meant that 10% of the electors could actually recall your MP. You didn't like your MP, they pissed you off. Fine, you got 10% of your buddies, you can get rid of them and recall them. The initiative, which meant that, again, something in Parliament that the Tories passed, you didn't like that, would get 10% of your parties. You could basically launch a new initiative to actually get it off the books and put your own bill on the books. And of course, binding referendums to essentially ensure that basically that, again, you could actually have popular control. And this was seen as essentially the way in which socialism, or the Labour Party conceived it, would be best exercised and so on by people. Unsurprisingly, all these proposals were dropped in the 1930s. And the reason for that was basically that the closer that Labour got to parliamentary power, i.e. the closer it became to becoming the government, the less enamoured it became of all these sorts of policies. And so they were slowly and absolutely dropped. And in the case of proportional representation, there were actually in Christchurch, here in Christchurch, the council was actually elected by proportional representation on a number of occasions throughout the 1900s and all the way through the 1920s by Labour councils. So the Labour Party would be elected, implement PR voting, then lose the Tories, who essentially then reintroduce ward voting. And in 1933, Labour actually won, again implemented PR, but then was forced into the situation because its policy had changed to actually opposing PR, was forced to actually come to the Christchurch City Council and then vote down the very amendment that it actually supported, whereupon it lost the election. And the Christchurch press was quite happy to crow that if Labour had actually kept PR, it would have been you know, the mayor and the council and so on like that. It would have actually won the councilship. But because it changed it, they had won and Labour was now out. And as a result, we had to wait until, what was it, 1993 to actually get proportional representation. So, you know, just I can talk a lot about that, about the sort of dealings between the Liberals and the Labour Party. It was actually quite a little spat between them two. So that's essentially how Labour thought it was best to actually implement socialist constitutional reform. Now, as I said, initially Labour sought an increased role for workers in the economic and social spheres and radical electoral participation through a combination of direct and indirect democratic frameworks. But if Labour had been elected in 1922, its socialist program, or its program at that time, committed it to large-scale public ownership, mines, factories, land, also things like, for example, healthcare, social security, all these things and so on. And although stopping short of direct democracy, Labour championed the idea, as I said, of radical electoral reform and proportional representation. Now, after 1930, or rather as the 1920s wore on, Labour became, as I said, less enamoured of these sort of views. And throughout the 1920s and 1930s, socialism in any form lost its predominant role as a defining and guiding objective for the party. So while the party retained a sort of desire to achieve a more equal and fairer system, socialism was not necessarily the means by which this could be achieved. And throughout this period of time too, Labour became aware, particularly around that time of Great Depression, that essentially it really didn't actually have a program. And come 1929, when the Great Depression, 1930, when the Great Depression hit, of course, and you saw the defeat and so on of Labour administrations in both Australia and, of course, in the UK. Administrations who incidentally used, basically adopted policies of saying things like, well, if we can lower taxes, balance the budget, retrench, then obviously we'll be able to actually resolve our economic problems. These were Labour administrations, and they didn't. And if anyone thinks that's familiar to what we're actually doing now, they're quite right. It was crap 80 years ago, 90 years ago, it's crap now. Then essentially, there was a real crisis in the Labour Party in New Zealand by saying, well, look, we don't actually have a well thought out economic policy. If we are elected into government tomorrow, we have no actual plan about what we are going to actually do. And there's a whole series of letters written to Walter Nash, who was General Secretary, from people like Savage, from Jordan, from Semple, from Lord Mason, all these senior Labour pickers saying, what the fuck are we going to do? We are going to lose. We're going to be elected, and we don't know what the crap we're going to do once we get into Parliament. God help us. And so basically they also became increasingly critical of Harry Holland, because Harry Holland, of course, was still going around basically saying that the solution of this would be found in the election of the socialist government that would instantly nationalise it. And essentially it was around about this point that Savage, who was the key economic spokesperson, along with James Coombs, who of course was the Labour MP for Littleton, started talking a lot about enlightened capitalism. So essentially they said, well, you don't really need to get rid of capitalism. What you just have to do is tweak it a bit. And how you tweak it is essentially to have things like, for example, deficits, increased consumption, and you do all these sorts of things, and essentially we can make it better and we can make it work for us. And so this started to occur around about 1927, basically, and as a means of actually overcoming the fact that Labour had no real philosophy and so on at this point in time. Now, when the NZLP did mention socialism, which was very rarely at this point, then essentially it would do so in brackets. It refined it as meaning that socialism just meant a better and more kinder society. So essentially that was what it meant and so on with that. So socialism did not really define the New Zealand Labour Party as such, rather the New Zealand Labour Party defined what it meant by socialism. And so that was essentially it. So by the time you got to 1931, Labour had actually revamped its policies quite substantially, and you got what was then known as basically, well, what emerged in 1935. So in 1931 they committed themselves, for example, to basically subsidies, they committed themselves to basically regulations, they committed themselves to control, and they committed themselves to what would later become known as the welfare state. And in 1935 they essentially built upon that to an even greater degree. And by this time the Conservative, or belief in the Conservative Party, had completely collapsed. So in fact, you know, Labour was had thrown off sort of any idea that in fact it was after some sort of radical revolution. And in 1935 there's actually an interview and so on with one of the business leaders in the New Zealand Herald, which I have, who basically said, well, Labour's being elected, I don't have any fear in a Labour government. They're going to do this, they're going to regulate, they're going to control, we can deal with that. And in 1949, even when National had basically achieved again the reins of government, Nesta, one of their, I can't remember his first name, but one of their basically politicians said, well, we really don't fear the use of controls and regulations anymore that Labour has actually done. Socialism, they said, does not mean public ownership. There's been no public ownership, or very little of it, under the Labour government. So essentially by 1931 and by 1935, it was basically essentially really all over in terms of the socialist agenda. Basically, as I said, the other thing was that the Conservatives had already started to implement proto-Keynesian policies in the 1930s, and Labour increasingly adopted those policies of deficit funding and controls and regulations in 1931. The other thing that Labour became very enamoured with as well was Henry Ford. Throughout the late 1920s and 1930s, essentially it became very, very enamoured with Henry Ford, and basically what Ford was doing in his companies to actually combat the Great Depression. And there were actually a number of articles in the New Zealand Worker, which was the magazine and so on, basically talking about the greatness of Ford. And in fact, if only Ford could move to New Zealand and basically take up basically a position here in the New Zealand government, he'd help Labour in no end. So that was essentially, you know, how Labour and so on actually thought come in 1931. So the conclusion, Labour advocated socialism in a very narrow sense and never really defined what the term meant, which was good for it. Labour policy was never really fully developed in years prior to the 1930s. And essentially, Keynesianism as an economic program allowed Labour to develop a coherent alternative economic program to what was actually happening. And by 1935, socialism was not mentioned anywhere in the Labour Party manifesto. So in fact, it was only mentioned, I think, once in 1931, and it certainly was not mentioned after 1935 at all. So that was essentially the end and so on of my PhD, by basically saying, well, was Labour a socialist party? Yes, it was, if you define socialism as being all about being nice to people. And, so in that sense, it certainly was, and, certainly Labour was a social democratic party. There's no debate about that in the modern sense of the word. But it wasn't what you'd actually see in terms of a sort of militant or a radical sort of socialist agenda. And to this end, the Labour Party was actually very similar to a number of other Labour parties, the UK Labour Party, which basically it loved. In fact, there was a bit of a love affair between the New Zealand Labour Party and the British Labour Party, so much so that in 1923, when Labour got elected, it had a 7-page colour pullout, and the New Zealand Worker and so on dedicated to the Labour Party, showing seat-by-seat analysis and policies of the British Labour Party. And it basically in 1929, when Ramsay MacDonald won, they had again another full-colour pullout and huge pictures of St Ramsay MacDonald on the front page, which kind of ended after MacDonald essentially sprang across and went to the Tories, and they sort of ended the love affair. Their love affair, of course, with the Australian Labour Party was never really as developed. In fact, it could be fair to say that the Australian Labour Party and the New Zealand Labour Party really hated each other, particularly Harry Holland, who saw the Australian Labour Party as a bunch of scabs and sellouts. And in 1923-24, Holland actually went to a visit to Australia, and essentially he was locked out of the Labour Party caucus, and essentially had to physically force himself into the caucus room. And he later wrote to Nash that he'd received more publicity from the Australian Labour Party if he'd been a dogfight promoter. So they have very, very low opinion and so on of the Australian Labour Party. So in that sense, as compared to the British Labour Party and to the Australian Labour Party, New Zealand Labour Party was relatively radical. That's not saying much. That's it.
Thank you so much, Quentin, for that. I'm wondering if we have a quick break that may, we're actually doing a live stream at the moment, and members of the Wellington Workers Educational Association are joining us live. That might give them some time to type through questions and things that we can add to a question list. So if we want to have a quick 5 to 10 minutes, we can get back to talking and asking questions of Quentin and really, nailing him on some of these minutiae of questions.
I'm sure it knows his stuff.
Jim McElwain still around?
Yes, Victoria.
Yeah, I just put white ones here.
Basically, he'd been really useful. He would have been really useful if he actually knew what he was talking about. Whereas the supervisor didn't know.
Oh, right. You didn't go and see Jim?
Well, I did. I had some problems, but because of the fact that the universities now, they don't like sharing supervisors because if they do that, so you essentially lose money every PhD or master.
You didn't Bob Gidlow?
Yes, I like that. And
You might not have known that he would have been on your side.
well, you told me by my supervisor. The thing was that Bob admitted that he was very good at sociology, but he had no knowledge. He admitted that he was so, and I agreed why. So unfortunately Bob was at sea, and Greg was very uninterested in the Labour Party. If the Labour Party played cricket or being involved in beer, because Greg's basically his interest in sports and beer, he had been all over it.
So hard. I mean, I've got a sister-in-law who's going to do a PhD in architecture, and she got given full-time building supervisor or something, in the wrong department, and the wrong person. It was just a waste of time.
Yeah, that's, I mean, I understand for example, he doesn't do it.
You want it?
He doesn't do it.
You don't? No, you just pass.
You just pass.
Yeah, well, you just pass the night.
Yeah, and so basically it's sort of like this method, they say yes. So
You can get 3 out of 2 out of 3.
well, no, because when I was in the supervisors, you know, they had to particularly around the parliamentarianism, because apparently no one was ever done and so and then of course he had to defend it, you
I downloaded it somehow or other. I found it.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. Downloadable on the internet. Not that I read it all, but I had a quick look. I thought,
well, I'm actually making it into a book, rewriting it, a couple of years, rewriting it, so
it's a good idea, isn't it?
So hopefully I can get that done in a couple of months, but of course the job to rewrite it, of course we have to cut things out.
Yeah, you also need to, I don't know how the piece is, but chapters and focus and story.
Now the first thing you have to take out character is in this case it's going to include the following. They have to go, footnotes.
Do they?
I know, you know, I think, well, basically, well, I picked up an interesting book from Richard and basically a couple of whole line of footnotes. And I had at least 4 So is that okay? You understood all that?
Well, by feeling weak. You need
Socialism at the start and not so now.
See if we get some questions, Q. Be interested to see you get. Looks like you might have a couple questions coming up.
But yeah, like what happened in 2012?
So is that okay?
Yeah, so I thought it was great. It's a shame that the microphone, so you could have been standing facing us. But that's by the end of it, you basically you. we're looking that way. Oh wow. But I did find it very interesting. Well, good quality whiskeys. So, no. So basically, well, that's the thing. This, I think Tony knows a wholesaler. Like they got maybe $80, but this is less expensive than whiskey and more type. So we're getting very high quality. Like one of the things Tony and Jeff said that they had for about $80 they were getting a $150 bottle. So I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, so they're definitely high value. Probably a couple of years for cheese or something. Not Rhino. Habs Blue River.
Well, yeah, because we've been driven out now.
Oh yeah, she was the one that called me as I recognised my phone. No, he's got any photos back. I'm not going to Google photos.
You just go to the therapist, say, you're not library they're like, oh, the crisis so what are you? It's just like, there's no sense of you. Joe Kelly came down. Oh, no, Joe. He did the round 2 training, first 2 days. And he was popped with an arm. He's going to come down into the 3rd day, which is interesting. The biggest part of it is actually the training to facilitate your meeting. But also, he told me that Jay's fresh. Usually they do. The wage system and talks about that.
Have you gone through any training before?
No, I want to. I tried to ask PSA and social workers to very well via here 4 months a year. I just didn't work.
Let's go along. Like John doesn't like me. I just ask him along. It's really useful.
Yeah.
It's very good.
Yeah, I might just see if I can find the idea or something for him. Cool. But then you have to watch while you're answering questions. So I'll do this. I'll do the bit. You can answer questions. All right. We'll regather everyone and take questions. I will be happy to take a speaking list so that Quentin can focus on answering any questions people have. So I'll pass it over to Quentin and have a think if I have a question, because that's always useful, but I didn't think of one in the book. Whoops. I had something about Fabianism to ask you, but I think it'll come back to me. I've explained. Hand you the mic in.
That's okay.
All right. Do you think it is a worthwhile endeavour to try and make a left wing in the current Labour Party, in the current environment? Like,
Been there and done that. Paul Pierce and I were actually colleagues in the New Zealand Labour Party in the 1980s when the Labour Party, of course, erupted into open civil war and so on amongst itself. And basically, I mean, there are two ways of actually looking at it. Like after the 1980s, of course, those of us on the left of the Labour Party at that point decamped and so on, and went with Jim Anderton and formed the new Labour Party in the alliance. And ironically, just to show how screwed up the Labour Party was, the right wing of the Labour Party decamped and automatically formed ACT. So you actually had two completely opposite, polarly opposite political parties being formed out of the same political party. I mean, to tell the truth, no. I mean, I don't get the impression that there's any sort of left wing and so on within the Labour Party. I mean, you know, I went to a Labour Party meeting, actually courtesy of the RMTU several years ago and so on. We were actually picketing. And I was actually one of the younger people and so on at their meeting. And so, you know, exactly. And it was like, it was like, okay, fine. And, you know, I mean, it could be elsewhere. I mean, but certainly I haven't seen it. They don't operate the same, like in the 1980s, for example, even during this period of time. Essentially, when you'd had remits, you'd debate with remits and so on at council, you actually had, you know, formation of groups and so on who challenged the leadership or challenged policy. And I get the impression now that the Labour Party isn't really into that because, you know, it's not really seen as, yeah, that's right. It's publicity, you know, they're really publicity shy, and so you don't sort of challenge these sorts of things and so on too. So yeah.
So that's a no. You have more fun.
Yeah.
We shouldn't join the Labour Party on that.
So to follow up on that, is there any socialism left in the Labour Party?
Well, I haven't actually met any socialists in the Labour Party, though I'm pretty sure that there are. I mean, Len Richards is signed as a socialist, and you know, I mean, I do know that there are people who are socialists and so on in the Labour Party. What I think the real question is there actually any sort of coordinated left response in the Labour Party? And the answer to that is, I don't think so. You know, I certainly can't see it. It's not the same party that I remember from, say, the 1980s, or indeed, you know, anything between that. I think that essentially it's a party, like, I refer to it as really, are you familiar with Glenn Campbell? You know Glenn Campbell, the country western singer? Well, Glenn Campbell had a song in the early 70s called Try a Little Kindness. And that's essentially what the Labour Party is all about. It's trying kindness. And so essentially there wasn't really that sort of socialist philosophy or so on. There are even a left-wing philosophy, you know. There are no Jeremy Corbyns in the New Zealand Labour Party.
Shannon, I had a quick question. It's probably yes or no. I don't know. The way I understood what you talked about with ethical socialism, would it be fair to sum it up as like ethical socialism as like a way to establish a class peace, whereas socialism proper would be more like an abolition of classes? Like, it's a very different goal. Would you think?
Well, there are 57 variants of socialism, and there are now 147 different variations of socialism. Socialism, you know, initially was never about the abolition of class. You know, basically, you know, accepted that in fact that there would be some sort of injustices and so on. And in fact, originally socialism had nothing to do with communism and so on at all. And Engels makes that point and so on in, you know, the preface and so on to the Communist Manifesto in 1895, I think. But I mean, I think ethical socialism was again just really a means by which they could actually draw together the disparate groups and so on in the Labour Party by saying, well, look, we're all after actually creating a better society, one in which people can participate, one in which, you know, basically there'll be jam on your bread tomorrow, there'll be healthcare, there'll be education, there'll be all these things. And so as a means, people could all march towards that common goal. You know, whether or not that goal was actually achievable in the long term, of course, you know, it's a different question altogether. But, you know, essentially that was what ethical socialism, I think, was about. And it's a belief that still, I think, prevails within the modern Labour Party as well.
Shannon and David.
I'll be honest, I came in halfway through your lecture and I'm sorry for that. So, just a couple of things. Seems like there is quite a strong trend of that ethical socialism still now, and that idea that tax is love, not rational. Like it's not a thing we do like because it makes sense. We're so generous and lovely. Very much counterposed to the scientific Marxist-Leninism, which has like some amazing, just like I would like to have a whole lecture just on that, of like the way that space and like the communal apartments in Soviet Russia and stuff were like allocated just on this very scientific basis. My actual question, just because that's cool and it's magical realism, but my actual question is, David and I initially disagreed quite a lot about what the purpose of having like a Labour presence or whatever, it's now become Young Labour, on like universities might be, and I sort of thought like, this is a bad idea, we don't want these like idiot people like, as a former, or one of them. And David sort of talked about how it was like quite an important like place for the Labour Party to maintain some of its like more radical leanings. And I'm wondering what you think about the kind of dissolution of the party, or the, you know, the national political parties in that campus space, or with younger people, or, you know, who have some time maybe to who are not indoctrinated already.
Okay. Well, I used to.
We were talking more about the Socialist Society, not
We
the,
were.
the Labour Party in the sense. I mean, I think when Shannon says the Labour Party, she means the Socialist movement. We're not specifically talking about young Labour branches.
But it has. No, we're not. Yeah.
Well, we weren't.
No, we weren't.
Well, there are several points I think to be made. First of all, you're quite correct. I mean, essentially, there are a whole, like I said, there are a whole range of number of socialist variants and so on in the Labour Party, ranging all the way from utopian socialism, Christian socialism, which is all about, you know, in fact, the case that the Labour Party and socialism was all about the teaching of Christ, and that motivated people like Walter Nash and so on like that. Basically, romantic socialism, which motivated by people like Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde was actually a socialist at one point, and Fabian socialism. And Marxian socialism was basically there, but it wasn't actually a big influence, particularly in the New Zealand Labour Party. Now, certainly there were key people in the New Zealand Labour Party. Harry Holland is without doubt Labour's only leader who can actually say he was a Marxist. He committed himself to Marxism, he had read Marxism, he knew, he actually quoted Marx and so on in Parliament. But Marxism itself was never ever really one of the guiding tenets of the New Zealand Labour Party. So I think that, you know, essentially what Labour wanted, and it comes back to the ethical socialism idea, was essentially a nicer kind of future and so on like that. So yeah. In terms of Labour, Young Labour, well, I mean, you know, I don't want to really bag Young Labour. I mean, for my sins, I think that Dave Collier probably knows this, but I used to be the president of Labour Youth. In fact, as we called it, Labour Socialist Youth, back in the 1980s, and basically when all the crap, yeah, that's right, when all the crap went down, and I was reminiscing, of course, with Paul Pierce tonight, and basically about it and how we were lectured to once, I remember, by Ken Douglas, who came along and said, oh, you guys are not really socialists, and if you're socialists, you'd be like me in the Socialist Unity Party, and I've never sold out. And it's like, yeah, ha, Ken, yeah, it's funny. And, you know, but, I mean, at the time in the 1980s, there was very much a very large debate going on about the Labour Party, and the reason for that and what Labour actually stood for. And the reason for that was because the fourth Labour government was, well, crap. It was essentially a right-wing government. It was the first ACT government that basically started implementing things that were completely polar opposite to social democracy even. And so as a result, it prompted a huge discussion, and people in Labour youth, like, we were split. You know, and there were one Labour Youth conference I remember where essentially punches were thrown. I was actually at a meeting where Helen Clark's electric secretary knocked out Richard Pribble's electric secretary. We had 10 meetings and so on where chairs were thrown, where people were basically, you know, and that was sort of the state of the Labour Party at the time. But it was because of the fact that there was really, people cared about the history of the Labour Party and the philosophy and so on of the Labour Party. And I don't really see that as actually happening today. You know, I haven't really picked that up. I'm not saying that there aren't people in the Labour Party who don't believe these things, but certainly they're not as visible or as vocal as they were, say, 30 years ago. Does that kind of answer your question? Yeah.
David, then we've got a question from Wellington, then we've got Hyman.
Yeah, we've in our last drinks last month, we had a Scottish guy come along who's a Labour Party member, British and now New Zealand Labour Party, and he's quite keen on getting socialists into the Labour Party. I thought he might be here tonight, but anyway, I'll introduce you to him sometime. And you can, I tried filling him in on the history of why someone like me would never ever join the Labour Party as a matter of principle. I mean, if other people want to give it a go, that's fair enough, but I certainly not sure it's how much. Anyway, the question I wanted to ask was really to do with turning the clock right back. You mentioned, I think I took a photo of the thing, but it was one of the Labour organisation's precursors. Photos so blurry. The one that was on the top right, which was formed in 1905, and
the Political Labour League.
Yeah, I think that was the one. Yeah. So I was researching the history of Labour Day, and therefore looking at the 1890 maritime strike and then the election that was held that year, which saw the leader of the strike, the leader of the Seamen's Union down in Dunedin, was elected as a Liberal Labour MP. A guy elected in Heathcote Electric who was a bootmaker and bootmakers unionist who was known as the first Labour candidate. I'm not sure why none of the others got that honour. But there was a bunch of them, and later on Harry Allen and a few others. And reading that history, they were regarded as a Labour Party within the Liberals for a time, and then they sort of split as they kind of ended up, I suppose, identifying with different factions of the Liberal Party. The guy that had been the Seamen's Union hoped to become the leader of the Liberal Party and the Prime Minister, but by that time he'd fallen out with the other Liberal people because he was a drinker and they were mostly prohibitionists. Well, that was part of the reason. And he ended up defecting to the Tories and supporting the suppression of the next big strike.
Yeah.
Anyways, in 1905 there was an attempt here in Christchurch among dissident Liberal MPs to form what they called the New Liberal Party. And I just wondered, apparently there was a meeting held in Papanui, and I think Christchurch North, which covered that, was held by, is it Taylor?
Yeah, Taylor.
Yeah, so he was a Liberal MP there. I don't know if he was part of that group or not. So history's a bit sketchy. When
He was.
Yeah, so I just wondered if there was a link between the sort of the fact, or the Lib Labs and the different factions in the Liberal Party and this Political Labour League, because I know Seddon had formed the Liberal Labour Federation or something as an attempt to form a party organisation that brought working class support into the Liberals, but that wasn't universally supported. And so there's all this kind of factionalism as the Liberal coalition, as they stayed longer in power and people got dissatisfied, and I just wondered how that fitted in.
Well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, the New Liberal Party was an interesting sort of party in the sense it wasn't really a party. In fact, it wasn't even really a coherent group. They didn't even vote the same way and so on in the House. They were just really, what really motivated them was actually a hatred of Seddon. And so essentially they'd turn up there. Taylor was certainly involved. Fisher was involved. Al was sort of on the fringes and so on of it. There were a number of other Liberals and so on who were actually involved, but they didn't actually have a coherent policy as such, and they didn't really even, they'd occasionally caucus and so on as a sort of a separate party, but they weren't really a political party as we recognised them, and certainly much to Seddon's great delight, they certainly didn't actually act in any sort of unified way. And so that was what he was, but there was some crossover, because you actually got a number of Liberals who were very sympathetic to the political Labour lead. George Folds was one of them. Trigger, who of course wasn't an MP but was certainly head of the first Department of Labour, he was very sympathetic. And essentially a number of others and so on too who were quite, and Taylor himself, who actually wrote one of the articles for the Maori Land Worker when it first came out in 1910. And they were very, very sympathetic, but a number of them, even though they were Labour Lib Labs, essentially never really formally endorsed, and in some cases were quite hostile to the Labour Party, to the emerging Labour parties. And I'm reminded too, I know exactly who you mean, like I think it was Pendle Reeves who responded, the first 5 Labour MPs to be, or rather, no, weren't MPs, actually members of the Executive Council to be appointed. He described them as 5 nice, unassuming people who throughout their time and so on really didn't say much on behalf of Labour, even though they'd actually come from working class backgrounds. And I think one of them, I think it was Miller, who was basically head of the Maritime Council or so on, they actually ended up becoming a Tory. He essentially, in the end, he shifted right across the political spectrum and basically became a Tory. So I think that the connections were fairly loose, and certainly a number of MPs, like Folds is one of them, essentially became very active in the United Labour Party. That basically did actually promote it. Tommy Taylor, of course, died, I think, in 1910. There was also some debate, though he was actually very sympathetic and so on to Labour and so on as well. But he basically got himself out of Parliament, became Mayor of Christchurch, and then of course died of tuberculosis. But they were quite sympathetic, and like I said, Trigger was very sympathetic, Folds was very sympathetic, but when it came to actually forming the SDP, there's actually a quote and so on in that meeting from the basically the conference notes from the Unified Conference in 1913, where George Folds said, "I can't stay here. I cannot support Harry Holland and all these radical socialists. These people are destroying the Labour movement, they're destroying the country, I'm leaving," sort of things. And so essentially, that was as far as their radicalism really went.
Yeah, and Al, of course, lost his seat to Labour MPs, MPs standing with Labour in 1913.
Yeah. Well, I mean, interestingly, people like James McCombs essentially, had been very active in the sort of the Liberal-Labour coalition. Basically, and of course McCombs later on became a Labour MP and was until his death in 1932, 1933.
Yeah, well, Al switched from Christchurch South to stand in Littleton and lost to McCombs, and then later tried to stand back in Christchurch South, which is simply won by a Labour MP and lost to the MP.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious about those, how, that, because obviously there was behind those splits was a formation of the idea that they needed an organisation independent from the Liberals.
Right, to sort of bring us into the present day, the history is all very fascinating, and you're right, a lot of New Zealanders are not aware of this history. It's not taught. You have to read it yourself. I know a little bit because of my union membership, but I think most of us here are probably self-identified socialists. Where would you suggest we go? Are you a member of a party, and if so, which one? Where can socialists find a political home in New Zealand?
Well, I'm going to lay my cards on the table. Essentially, I joined the Labour Party. I went and saw this young woman in the Labour Party. I went up there and thought, oh, God, I'll go and join. And so I went there and saw this young woman and so I up there and handed across my $20 and said to her, so do you guys still believe in democratic socialism? And she had to go and check in the Constitution as to whether it was there. And then she said, oh, do we actually? I said, it used to be printed on the back of your membership cards. And she said, oh, really? Oh, I don't deal with that sort of thing. So basically I was sort of like, fine. And for a while I was actually a member of the Greens, but I found them really, really frustrating, you know, if you know what I mean. And so, actually, I'll be honest, I mean, since the demise of the new Labour Party, a party which I spent a lot of time, well, I was actively involved in actually forming in the alliance, I've really been very homeless. And so, you know, essentially, even though I vote for the Greens and I vote for Labour, I kind of, in the words of the old instinct, I want something else. Unfortunately, I can't see something else roaring across the, you know, the political spectrum at this point in time to actually help that. Even though I think that there is probably space for an actual left-wing social democratic party, but you know, that's another conversation.
Sorry, Rick, did you want to say? Yeah, then Martin.
Thank you, very interesting talk. This is a simple yes or no question, but I'll just give a basis on which I think the answer is yes.
Yeah.
The question is the Labour Party a right-wing party? Now I believe that it is so because I'll take the history back just a few years ahead of what you're talking about, and where did the one big union come from? In other countries it formed the Labour Party, but in New Zealand's history the Labour Party formed the one big union, the Federation Labour in 1937. And therein you had the dictatorship of the proletariat by the Labour Party. That is, they were using it as a mechanism for coordinating and controlling the working class through their unions. And they went on to use that to cancel the 1942 general election and form a coalition of nationalists. Admittedly, we were under pressure from Japanese invasion. That's what they believed at the time. And cancel all strikes, etc. And so revolt the working class that they were thrown out in 1939. So again, is this history formed at that time? Incidentally, in amongst that was in the war industries, the engineers union arose in the birth of the New Zealand aircraft industry as the linchpin of what that right-wing nature of the Labour Party is. That fundamental role of that union, it's still there today. So is the Labour Party a right-wing party or a left-wing party?
Well, the Labour Party is a neoliberal party. Basically, in terms of the political spectrum, yeah, it was probably something right. Basically, the sad thing is, of course, the National Party is more right-wing than the Labour Party, and I think that basically says something about the political spectrum here in New Zealand, and the fact that it's so steered to the right that every political party, including the Greens, are to the right of what we'd expect political parties to have been, say, you know, 30 years ago. So in that sense, Rick, you're quite right. You know, essentially it is a right-wing party. You know, in terms of the one big union, I don't know essentially about how to actually answer that. I do know that the Wobblies, of course, were involved in so on the 1913 strike, and they were one of the first victims and so on to actually of basically Massey and of the government and so on at the time. It was what that actually led the Red Feds and others to actually form the SDP, and then eventually, of course, the Labour Party to bring some unity and so on to the Labour movement. So essentially, I think that really there were ongoing sort of syndicalists and so on action, even within the Labour Party. They actually took over the Maori-land worker at one point and provoked a huge fight and so on with Harry Holland and the Labour Party. But essentially they were dislodged, and by about 1930 they were completely a spent force, and that's the only way to actually describe it.
That's cool, because I was actually going to ask what happened to the Wobblies after 1912 and 13. You've just answered that. They sort of fell apart after I've got Martin.
Yeah, you drew a lot of parallels between the British Labour Party and the New Zealand Labour Party, quite rightly. I mean, obviously a lot of the inspiration, I think, for some of the New Zealand Labour Party British Labour Party has never had a leader as radical as Harry Holland, so that might tell you something about the British Labour Party. But I want to pick up on this point here. So, I mean, the two big parallels for me for socialists are that for a long time in the UK they tried to operate within the Labour Party, and the other big thing, of course, was to operate within the trade unions. Now, with the collapse of trade unionism in the UK, and I think from what I gather here also to a large extent, where do socialists therefore look to operate? You know, if we don't operate in the Labour Party and there's no union movement as such to operate in at the moment, then where do socialists operate? Where do they organise?
I'd refute that there's no union movement.
Well, nothing like on the scale of when the Labour Party was developing, where it was a mass trade union movement.
No, you're quite right. And sorry, before you get in there, Quentin, I mean, part of the problem is that we had arbitration. I mean, the Federation of Labour Associations and the enforced arbitration actually led to the unions being very complacent, and when we had, you know, what happened in the 80s and neoliberalism came along, most of the unions and the unionists weren't actually prepared to, even though the you know, the members wanted to have a fight, were basically sold out by the leaders, and Ken Douglas is one of them. When you say earlier that, you know, he said you're a sellout and you don't join in, bloody hell. I mean, he sold out the union movement. So we're at a point now where you have to actively recruit members. So it's actually a much more real situation than what we had pre-1984. I think there's actually quite a lot to be optimistic about what's happening in the labour movement, especially for those of you who were at the talk the other day by the unionist panel, especially what, you know, unions like Unite and First are doing. But we still have incredibly restrictive labour laws in New Zealand. We have the most restricted right to strike in the OECD, and that's saying something. I mean, we can literally only go on strike during bargaining in pursuit of claims for that bargaining, or on health and safety grounds. We cannot go on strike for so-called political strikes. We cannot go on strike in support of other unions. The union density that we once had pre-1984, which some unionists you know, clamour for, that's not necessary to be effective. What we do need is some more more liberal labour laws, i.e. the right to strike. And it doesn't matter whether, I mean, in France, for example, they have no more union density than we have in New Zealand, but they can all go on strike, and they do.
Can I just ask, this is not a serious question, is this idea of health and safety gone mad related to the fact that you can only strike on, you know, for some
Health and safety gone mad. That's a right-wing meme.
I know, but is that a response to the fact of the labour laws, meaning that you need to use health and safety as a pretense?
Well, okay. Imagine you're a business owner and you want to do whatever you want, and that's what literally happens in non-unionised work sites in New Zealand. In fact, I think people would be most New Zealanders and these nice people who vote Labour. I mean, I've been like, because we're an affiliated union still. I mean, every conference, every 2 years we have a conference, and someone puts a remit we should disaffiliate from Labour. Now, you know, I've been to Labour Party meetings. When I was branch secretary at Littleton, first thing you do is and Ruth Dyson, you know, has gone into bat for us and done a lot for us in our disputes at Littleton. But she's just one person. If you're a boss and you want to do whatever you want, any restriction on that, and I mean, just look at the surveys that get done. You know, there was one again recently. You know, New Zealand is one of the easiest places in the world to do business. What does that mean? It means low taxation and lax regulation. So even when you pass all these new laws, so for just one simple example, the new health and safety legislation, which I believe was 2015, was enacted a year later or within 6 months. one of the many fights we've had at Littleton, because we have 3-shift rosters, is to have an effective fatigue management policy. The port still does not have a fatigue management policy, even though it's required by law under the new health and safety legislation to have one. All of those, once you implement, so changing the law isn't enough.
There have been lots of deaths at the Littleton port.
They have.
Is my point, is that it's a pretty dangerous place to work.
It's an inherently dangerous
and this way of
work
writing
environment.
off health and safety as if it's not, as if it's something cultural rather than like related to the working conditions is like perhaps something.
It's both, and we need to have a really meaningful discussion around that. I mean, in our last round of bargaining, when we went on strike, when we really kicked off, when the CEO finally got involved in the bargaining, and he was asked about fatigue management and the fact that we're required to have a policy under the new legislation, he literally asked, well, what's fatigue got to do with rosters? Well, that's all very well if you sit in your bloody office 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. But those of us who work 3-shift rosters and are operating heavy machinery, it makes a big difference. So the simple answer to your question is yes.
Yeah.
So, just following up, I mean, so you need a change in the labour laws. So that would suggest that you do need to operate in the labour party.
Well, this is the thing.
But on the other hand, you're saying that even when they've got laws, they're not followed. So I come back to my original question then. So, as socialists, where?
In New Zealand, I believe we're not very good at the implementation. So we might pass laws and we think, oh, this is all very good, and so on. I mean, the legislation that's gone through around, you know, what was it? The climate. What do they call it? To do with climate change. What is it?
Zero.
Yeah. It's probably too late. But anyway, it's very nice. It's a great gesture. What will actually happen in reality? You know, we're so, and that means that we've got to be very active at grassroots level. It's very important that the unions mobilise and actually get their workers to go on strike when it's necessary. That means you know, campaigning, means educating, recruiting. Otherwise, you know, the kind of things that the deaths that happen, or Pike River, for example. I mean, you know, that's anything you read on Pike River. I mean, it was a disaster waiting to happen. With hindsight, of course, you can see that. But when you systematically make it so easy for a business to operate that they can actually completely disregard even the lax health and safety regulations that there are, you know, that's what you get. So
maybe read what Lenin said about economism. Following trade unionism was never going to lead to liberation.
Well, sure, but you know, where are we at? What else is going on in New Zealand?
Well, let's just wake up out of this orientation we've had, what is it, 100 years?
Yeah.
As to which way we're going to have to go forward. Because we've tried all these reformist methods and that's what's failed. Short and simple. Start again.
There was a question.
I think Martin, a while ago, Martin was asking, so no to the Labour Party, but the union movement is small or not very, very powerful. Where should socialists go? What could we be doing to organise if it's not the Labour Party, but the union's not very strong? There you go. Answer. Solve our problem.
You want me to answer that in 2,000 words or less. I mean, it's really difficult. Actually, I take your points, but I actually disagree fundamentally with
Yeah, okay.
And I think that one of the success, I actually think that New Zealand was actually really good at one point actually implementing a parliamentary policy. But just the fact that since the 1980s in particular, the policy that the government has committed itself to, and with great zest and vim, by the way, has all been about, you know, essentially about getting rid of labour rights and getting rid of unions and getting rid of social conditions and so on like that. And so essentially I think that unions, and you know, prior to 1984, I mean, I've had a long think about this. I remember working as a youngster in some of the 1980s at Watties, and unions were industrial based, so essentially the one big success, it was actually done not by the Tories with the Employment Contracts Act, but actually by the Labour Party and the Employment Relations Act in 1987, was actually inventing compulsory unionism by essentially saying that if you're in a union, you can compete and so on with other unions, you have mythical freedom of choice. And I actually think that essentially that has actually undermined unions to the extent now that you get the unions basically competing with other unions to actually get members. Instead of doing what they're that's right, exactly. It's exactly, it's neoliberalism in a union sense. So they've actually recreated neoliberalism for unions. And the danger it has been, for example, you know, the so you get the larger unions essentially destroying any of the smaller unions that stand there, instead of actually working to actually defeat the boss, defeat the employer. And the employers love it. They think, well, shit, you know, basically we can do this because we can play these unions off against each other. And, you know, we fall into it. I actually personally think, you know, and this has been my thought, that essentially compulsory unionism, yeah, definitely had its bad points. Arbitration had its bad points, but I tell you this, when I was working in Watties in 1986, and I did overtime, I got paid overtime, I got paid triple allowance, I got paid boot allowance, I got paid night allowance, and I knew that if anything bad happened to me, the union was there to actually protect me. I can't guarantee that now. And every time I go to the back of the Nupe office and I see the old awards there, that they all the way back, and you're very aware of how much workers actually lost. Very, very aware. And I can't see in any employment contract negotiated by any union since the return of the Employment Relations Act in 2000 in any way made up for that. That's just my personal opinion on it. In terms of the Labour Party, what you're saying that you're not satisfied with what was it, Harold Wilson, he wasn't a socialist, or Hugh Gate, I'm joking. But, you know, basically,
no,
it's very, very difficult. I mean, it's very difficult. I mean, essentially the British Labour Party, I'd actually argue, was probably more socialistic at certain degrees, and consistently so than the New Zealand Labour Party. And particularly since, you know, the 1950s, horribly under Hugh Gates. But I do take your point, you know, essentially it is very difficult, as we've actually said, to see any way forward. Because, you know, certainly I think that people should be involved, they should be politically involved, but the choices that you're actually given are just, well, they're actually not choices, are they? Essentially, they're really, you know. So I suppose that the only thing you can do is, you know, essentially try the best so you can, join groups, educate, become involved in so on in organisations and so on like this, and you know, yeah. I don't know what else to actually suggest. It's either that, going home, and playing Fortnite. So.
David.
Yeah, I'll try and tie this question to the present discussion. So Martin asked, you know, where should we put our energies? For me, anyway, the answer at the moment, and it's not an eternal answer, but the answer at the moment is to reviving the idea of socialism as a collective goal that can, you know, whether you're involved in the trade union movement or in social movements like climate change or maybe beneficiary advocacy or any of these things that try to, you know, activism around these current issues and solving the problems, we need that overarching vision of an alternative to cohere things together and to give us something bigger to fight for. So that leads to my question. Quentin, in your talk, you listed these different variations of socialism that existed in the Labour Party, but I mean, it's not at all clear to me necessarily what each of them were, and I wondered if you found in your research articulations of, you know, what, say, utopian socialism meant or what have you. I know that the socialism of Bellamy, I think the author of Looking Back,
yeah,
who William Morris wrote Views from Nowhere in reaction against, but he had a vision of a completely sort of state-controlled society, and that was influential both in whenever soon after it was written in the late 19th century, and then again there were Bellamy clubs, I think, in the 1930s as well. And so that idea, I suppose, it would have fitted in with the Fabian view. They were looking to achieve that sort of thing through gradual reform and what have you. But yeah, I just wondered if there were articulations of some of the different variations. We've had a bit of discussion within the Socialist Society about, you know, what we mean by socialism, and I'm sure we do have those, you know, we don't have, we have to allow for a few people to have.
We don't have 57.
Yeah, we don't have 57
Still 57 types.
Yeah, that's right, quite probably, and that's not necessarily a bad thing at this point. But yeah, I just wondered if you could give us a bit more detail, if you're aware of it, of what people actually meant, some of those different variations.
Well, there are sort of like common themes that sort of come across, and that is, you know, the theme of democracy, the theme of popular control, the theme of basically, you know, the lack of, you know, basically social, you know, social awareness and social provision and so on like that. That all come across. I mean, but I'll be honest with you. I mean, essentially, in some cases, it's pretty disparate. You know, that what you're actually looking at. There are now 147 different definitions and so on of socialism, and you can adhere to those sort of, you know, whatever one suits you. But I think that, you know, essentially when you're actually, like, when a lot of people and so on, for example, in the British Labour Party, for example, refer to socialism, what they're really referring to, of course, is, you know, economic control, regulations, essentially the welfare state. You know, and in that case, you know, popular control and so on like that doesn't actually play a very large, you know, a very large part in that. But there always has been that sort of, I believe anyway, one of the things that come across to me was essentially the idea of increased social provision, the idea that capitalism in some form or another would either be confronted or defeated, or basically restrained, basically popular control. So those are sort of the common themes that came across. But, you know, essentially, like I said, they tended to be really quite disparate in what they actually wanted. I know that probably doesn't explain it.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
It's a project for you, Tom. We need to define socialism in Kiwi
Are there
context.
any, you know, were there popular pamphlets other than Bellamy's book, or
Well,
circulated, or articles that were published?
Oh yeah, there are a number of them. I mean, you can go to basically, you know, essentially the New Zealand Labour Party, like I said, have a love affair with the UK Labour Party, and essentially they used to hand out the ILP's what is socialism with their, you know, so they do that. So I mean, you can certainly go there and look at that. You can look at the Maryland Worker, you can look at the New Zealand Worker, and again they'd have some sort of definition about what people think of socialism. But the one thing that's always interesting about New Zealand socialism particularly, as opposed to say British socialism, was in fact that at least in British socialism there were very strong sort of ideas, the idea of guild socialism, the idea of municipal socialism. They didn't actually play a large part and so on here, particularly in the New Zealand Labour Party. Socialism, according to the New Zealand Labour Party, was basically top down. So essentially the state would take control of something, the state was representative of the people, voila, you have socialism.
So earlier on with the Red Feds and so on, many of the leaders were later in the Labour Party. From what I've read, particularly in the book Red Feds, I can't remember who wrote it.
Olsen.
Yeah.
Eric Olsen.
Olsen, that's right. The implication seems to be that a lot of the more radical end of socialism and stuff would be more identifiable to those of us with sort of a Marxist background as socialism. Was influenced a lot by American visitors and actually De Leonism. So like Daniel De Leon's idea of, you know, a socialist party, which was like in a lot of ways a Marxist party, but unified with a sort of syndicalist union movement. So the idea of unions being organised by industry and being very democratic and sort of horizontally organised with delegation of power upwards, and that alongside a Labour Party, a Socialist Labour Party. It sounds like by the time that the New Zealand Labour Party was formed, whatever interest in De Leonism has waned, would you say? Like, yeah?
Yeah, gone.
Gone? Okay. the same people who thought it was good just gave up on it, or they've disappeared? And
Well, they still existed. I mean, but it had basically had been smashed by Maxis.
right.
And by the end of 1913, the union movement and the idea too of the syndicalists and the lionists and so on, and as well as even moderate trade unions, had essentially been dealt to by the Conservative government. And they've been dealt to very effectively. Essentially, a lot of Labour's leaders were actually in jail. They basically had the parties themselves, like even the Social Democratic Party, which was formed in the aftermath of it, was essentially bankrupt. The United Labour Party was essentially bankrupt and so on too. And so there wasn't really, by the time of the 1920s, syndicalists still existed, particularly at the upper echelons of the Alliance of Labour. They were actually still involved, and it caused a friction between the New Zealand Labour Party and the Alliance of Labour for a long time, because Cook and others, who basically were syndicalists, accused the New Zealand Labour Party of being the boss's party, of being, essentially a fifth column, and as a result, Harry Holland and others, essentially became very determined to basically drive them out. And so it was a very frosty relationship between the Alliance of Labour and between the New Zealand Labour Party. And that didn't actually end really until about the 1930s. And it only ended because of the Great Depression, because things got so bad and people lost so much livelihood and so on, that the Alliance of Labour, Cook and others, Roberts and so on, basically conceded their position. And James Roberts, of course, became very active in the New Zealand Labour Party, the uncrowned king of New Zealand is what they called it. And so basically that was what caused sort of like unity between the industrial wings and so on and the New Zealand Labour Party. But basically overall the syndicalists have been well and truly smashed by about the 1920s.
Cool. Well, it's almost 10 o'clock, so if there's no burning questions, I think it's fair to wrap up there. If anyone wants to linger and buy more beer off Space Academy, they wouldn't stop you. If you're not on the mailing list, please feel free to write your email down there. If you're interested in becoming a member, come and talk to a Social Society member. There are a few of us around for now, but it's getting late and I'm very tired. Otherwise, another round of applause just for Quentin. And our next meeting is the second Wednesday of December. I can't remember the date off the top of my head. It's the 11th. Thank you, Cleveland. And it's just a screening of Death of Stalin, which is a very funny movie because it's December and we're all tired. So we've got to watch it.
It was fun. Now, do you want one or do you want to pick it up on Saturday?
I'll pick it up on Saturday. Can I get you a beer, Quentin? You going to have another one? Or